Why is the sword and sorcery genre so appealing and so enduring? Well, that's because beyond the fantasy elements and convoluted plot lines, there's a simple reason behind the attraction. Cool weapon makes bad man brain go splat. Half of the appeal of fantasy TV shows, games, and manga is the fact that they have some of the coolest weapons in history. And Berserk, being a sword and sorcery series at heart, has equipment that makes real-life bladesmiths want to just quit their jobs. So in this video, we'll be taking a look at our top 10 weapons from Berserk, and we want you guys to keep one thing in mind. This list is purely subjective, meaning we're giving you our personal opinion here. If you guys disagree with any of these entries, then by all means let us know your favorites down in the comments, but without any further ado, let's get right into it. Griffith's Saber. Perhaps the one thing we don't talk about enough when it comes to Griffith is his sword. In the aftermath of the eclipse, people tend to forget that Griffith was once a great fighter. In fact, if you're an anime-only Berserk fan, then you'll know what we're talking about, because Berserk's exploits on the screen have mostly centered around the Golden Age. As a result, we've seen Griffith in action a lot more when compared to the manga, and consequently, we've also seen a lot of his iconic saber. This often gets forgotten in the monster talk, but Griffith was a rather clever man who made a rather clever choice when choosing a weapon for himself. He chose a saber because, in his world, sabers proved to be useful both on and off the battlefield. Regular arming swords and longswords are built for field use. Rapiers are built for dueling. Greatswords are meant to defend a large area with lots of movement, but sabers exist for both dueling and killing and are great for cavalrymen who need to cut down enemies as they mow through their lines. Some people forget this, but Griffith was a cavalryman himself, and his original saber looked a lot like a European cavalry saber. Given Griffith's lithe form, sabers also fit his fluid fighting style because it gives him greater range of motion. He's a dexterous little bastard, able to cut his opponent half a dozen times as they're trying to gauge his moves. Griffith's saber doesn't encumber him at all because it's much lighter than even teenage Guts' sword, and it gives him great cutting and decent thrusting power. But perhaps the most important thing about it is the mobility it allows him, which is one of the key reasons Griffith went undefeated in one-on-one combat for a very long time. Much of this weapon's iconic value comes from the fight that he has with Guts, which forces the latter to become a falcon, with many of those fight panels becoming part of manga history. But even beyond that fight, Griffith's saber is still iconic because he still uses it to this day. After that humiliating loss he suffered in the snow, you'd have thought he'd just rely on his god hand powers from now on, but he's trying to become king while posing as a human, so he needs to use human weapons to maintain his cover. What Griffith's current saber is iconic for is its power to stab people in the eye so deep that its tip comes out the back of their skulls. Doesn't matter if the target is human, ogre, or a friggin' Norse giant, Griffith's saber can cut through everything like a hot knife through butter. His original weapon might not have been good enough to stand up to Guts' longsword, let alone the monstrosity he now wields, but this new saber might just be a match for Dragon Slayer. We'll talk about that soon enough, but these are all the reasons why we think Griffith's saber deserves a spot on this list. It works well as a weapon, and it suits Griffith as a character perfect. Salamander Dagger. The only time a dagger is really useful in a sword fight is as an offhand weapon, but Isidro proves that daggers can take center stage as well with his use of the Salamander Dagger. This is the first of two weapons on our list that use magic to attack enemies, and that's important for reasons that should be obvious. Magic has become a rather integral part of the Berserkverse ever since Miura-sensei made the switch to hard fantasy around chapter 200. Everything that's happened since then has been rooted in Berserk's magic system, and the Salamander Dagger is one such object. It's a blade blessed with the power of fire elementals called salamanders. These tiny, lizard-like spirits give the blade the temperature of a raging forge if channeled properly. The dagger is primarily used to set enemies ablaze. Isidro uses it with a cutlass to make full use of both weapons' speed-based fighting style, and his preferred combo is to use the cutlass to slash through enemies and then stab them with the Salamander Dagger to finish them off. Now, admittedly, we haven't seen this particular weapon being used too many times, but that's mostly because of Isidro. His approach to battle still isn't that of a courageous frontline fighter. Isidro is fine with fighting and setting fire to enemies that are clearly monstrous, but when it comes to fighting men, he often fumbles the ball. That's probably because he's not used to outright killing people, which is a reflection of his childish mentality. Isidro probably doesn't realize that the evil spirits he's putting down every night with Guts are the souls of the departed, but this is just a maturity issue. In the hands of a more experienced user, the Salamander Dagger can be a devastating weapon because it could technically expand its own range by extending the flames that shoot out of its tip. If that's possible, then it opens up a world of new attack options and turns it from a tricky offhand weapon into a fiery arc of death. We believe that Isidro will use the Salamander Dagger to its full potential before the series is done and dusted with, but that doesn't diminish its iconic status. It's still one of the coolest weapons we've seen in Berserk, and it definitely tops something as absurd as, say, Adon's Trident. Sylph Sword! As a magical weapon, the Sylph Sword is an entirely different case when compared to the Salamander Dagger, because unlike Isidro, its wielder is quite used to fights to the death. The Sylph Sword replaces the rapier as Serpico's weapon of choice, which is a good thing, considering the fact that the rapier is only good for dueling as a weapon. Its construction means that it is primarily a thrusting and stabbing weapon, and though the rapier can slice and slash as well, those attacks just aren't as powerful as the former two. Moreover, rapiers are practically useless in the face of an armored opponent, which is something Serpico learned personally during his fight with Guts in St. Albion. So, him getting the Sylph Sword is a major upgrade because this thing cuts through flesh, bone, and even steel plate like the north winds cut through your skin. The Sylph Sword's primary ability is to use wind elementals, called sylphs, to deliver lethal slashes. Because of the inherent nature of wind itself, Serpico doesn't actually need to make contact with his target. He can just slash in their general direction, and the Sylph Sword will send out lethal shockwaves that slice through most things in said direction. Serpico can also use the sword to summon a mini tornado, which proves quite useful as a distraction or a shield. This was proven during he and Guts' fight with Emperor Ganishka because Serpico was able to erect a wind shield to protect himself and Guts from Ganishka's lightning strikes, and though it was a risky gamble, it worked. The Sylph Sword can also cut through water as well, provided it isn't dense enough or being concentrated using magic. When combined with the Sylph Cloak, it makes the user nearly unstoppable because the sword harnesses wind to attack enemies, and the cloak harnesses wind to make its user more mobile. This mobility includes flight, so Serpico can basically fly out of an enemy's range while attacking them with wind at the same damn time. It's an extremely cool weapon that makes perfect sense for its wielder, and it's one of our favorite blades from all of Berserk. Shirkei's Staff. In a lineup that includes fiery daggers and flying swords, a wooden staff feels a little out of place, but trust us when we say that Shirkei's Staff is probably deadlier than 99% of all weapons within the Berserk-verse. That's because it's what she uses to invoke her magic, and that makes it underrated, but definitely a weapon. Shirkei's Staff has been used by her in multiple ways. In her first appearance, she used it to create a magic circle from which she targeted and killed trolls with a combination of hair and fire magic. She can use her staff to concentrate and discover the trails and shrines of hidden nature deities, like she did with the Lady of the Depths at Enoch Village. She can use her staff to direct the magic of any entity she controls, like she did with the Wheel of Flame at Vertanis, and most importantly, 3 taps of her staff can break her out of a possession spell, which prevents Shirkei from losing herself in a ritual and causing collateral damage. As an added bonus, the staff is pretty sturdy and makes a good disciplining tool, as Isidro knows all too well, but this is just a very versatile weapon that could also potentially be wielded as a polearm if Shirkei trained for it. The weapon is made from magical wood, making it far more durable than any regular staff, and one bonk from its top would put you amongst the stars, not just make you see them. Some of you might question its inclusion on this list, but Shirkei's staff is one of our personal favorites because it fits her character as a witch so perfectly. And besides, it's a lot more useful than Salat's chakram, Urumi, or even his katars, which Guts has proved time and time again. So if you have complaints or suggestions, let us know in the comments down below. For now, we're moving on to the next weapon, which is Grunbeld's Hammer and Cannon Shield. Berserk has this habit of giving people weapons that reflect their nature. For Griffith, Miura drew a slender and fashionable saber that can still get the job done when it matters most. For Guts, he's always drawn weapons that are heavier than him, which always makes it impressive when he wields them. For Serpico, he chose a rapier because Serpico mostly fights in duels instead of the front lines. For Isidro, a cutlass and dagger fits perfectly because he's still a short little kid. Grunbeld's hammer is more of a practical decision than an aesthetic one, because he's quite possibly the largest human being in the series. Even when he was just a human, he had to move around the battlefield on a chariot because no horse could support his weight, especially when he put his armor on. He started using a warhammer as his weapon after he killed a tiger with one during a death match, and ever since, Grunbeld has been crushing fools' armors right into their sternums. But what's even more iconic about his loadout is the fact that his shield is also a weapon, where it has blades that can cut people. More importantly, it has a cannon built into it as well. This cannon is located on the underside of the shield with an opening that looks like a mouth, and if Grunbeld's massive warhammer doesn't get the job done, you best believe that this handheld cannon will. The combination of these two overpowered weapons makes Grunbeld a one-man army, and he doesn't even have to unleash his dragon form to take down swaths of enemies if we're being honest. Besides, this weapon combo is the only one that constantly keeps Guts on the back foot, which rarely happens, especially in a fight. Guts is the type of guy who would throw himself into a dragon's jaws to cut him open from the inside, but even he becomes cautious when the dragon can use literal explosives. Half of the reason we love Guts versus Grunbeld is because of the latter's weapons, and that's enough for them to have earned a spot on our list. Skull Knight's Sword. Most Berserk fans would tell you that if there's one weapon they'd love to possess from the series, it would be Dragon Slayer, but Berserk purists will tell you that they'd rather have Skull Knight's Sword because it's just as effective as the former, with none of its big heavy disadvantages. The first time we saw the Wandering Wraith's weapon in its full glory was shortly after the eclipse, and it has a design that can only be described as painful for both its user and the person it's being used on. Skull Knight's blade has a unique grip and hilt, in that both of them seem to be comprised entirely of thorns. The hilt has a crossguard that's reminiscent of a skyvone, while the grip itself is studded with protruding thorns that make it quite difficult for people of flesh and blood to hold on to. When Guts first used the Skull Knight's sword, he reacted to the hilt because it bit into his hand. Now, one can argue that this means it's unshakable because the sword embeds itself into the user's palm, but we like to think of the Skull Knight's blade design as having been constructed with him in mind. He's a ghost in an armor set after all. He can neither feel pain nor discomfort. A sword with a thorn grip means nothing to him, and if it makes his weapon more stable in his hand, all the better. As for its attacking power, well, we don't have to talk about that too much. We can just show you this scene from chapter 88 when the Skull Knight invades the Eclipse and turns multiple apostles into cooking ingredients. He's able to do with ease what Guts has to put his body and life on the line for, and while a lot of that is thanks to his nature as an interstitial being, a lot of it is also contingent on his sword's effectiveness. Skull Knight's weapon was designed to kill anything it touches, astral or otherwise, and that feature only gets an upgrade when he transforms it into its final state. When Skull Knight swallows his blade up to the hilt like a magician, he coats it in the behillets he's been keeping stored within his belly, and the sword goes from an apostle cutter to a dimension cutter. The Sword of Actuation, which is what Skull Knight calls his behelit-covered sword, is perhaps the ultimate weapon in the Berserkverse. With a single stroke, it can open a dimensional tear and send those caught within straight to the abyss. Or Skull Knight can harness its energy and cut through one layer of the astral world and arrive at another. That requires a degree of skill that only he seems to possess at the moment, but because he's done it once, we know it's possible. In fact, Skull Knight originally came up with the idea for the Sword of Actuation as a deterrent for the God Hand, because he believed it would be able to trap them within the abyss that they came from. And while that theory of his was stopped from being tested by Femto triggering the Great Roar of the astral world, it doesn't mean that the sword itself doesn't work as intended. In fact, it probably does. Skull Knight just picked the worst possible moment to experiment. Even if we keep that aspect of his sword to the side, watching him flying across a battlefield and turning enemies into shish kebab never gets old. A lot of that is thanks to his iconic weapon, which ranks among our top 5 Berserk weapons of all time. His sword is synonymous with him by this point. That's a statement that can be also made for his eternal rival, which brings us to Zod's Cleaver. If you look closely at each appearance made by the Immortal One, you'll notice that Nosferatu Zod never uses the exact same weapon twice. The weapon he used during his first appearance was different from the one he threw on the battlefield of Doldrum. His second encounter with Guts saw him using a Kushan Ramdao as his primary, but then he switched to using multiple weapons when he got a crack in it. But the one thing that's consistent with Nosferatu Zod's loadout is the presence of some sort of cleaver, which perfectly encapsulates who he is as a character. Zod is called the god of the battlefield. He's revered as a deity by mercenaries because he's been killing fools for centuries and is seemingly undying. When he gets into an altercation, Zod's preferred method of settling things is with a fight to the death, and he often uses language like "let's tear each other apart to our heart's content." That last line was one he specifically aimed at Guts because he was so impressed with the human's fighting style, the warrior within him couldn't contain itself. Nosferatu Zod is a man who wants to test himself against the absolute strongest beings in the universe. He lives only to turn living bodies into dead meat. He's like a butcher, carving a path of death through any enemies he comes up against, so a war cleaver fits his character perfectly. When he agrees to join Griffith's reborn Band of the Falcon, Zod participates in more traditional military engagements, and that's where his love of cleavers really shines through. When Griffith makes his first move to quote-unquote liberate Midland, we see the Immortal One mow down an entire Kushan flank contingent whilst dual-wielding cleavers. When he isn't using his apostle form to fight, his best friend is his blade, and whenever you see Zod approaching, you just know that his butchering device won't be too far away from it. The cleaver is part of what makes Zod himself iconic because it reflects his bloodthirsty nature perfectly. To him, humans and even apostles are just sacks of meat unless they can prove themselves worthy, and that's why his weapon is one of our absolute favorites from the entire series, despite the fact that it technically keeps changing. Guts' left arm! We're entering top 3 territory, and as you guys might have guessed by now, all of these weapons belong to the same person. That makes sense, not just because Guts is the main character of the series, but also because his quest demands extraordinary measures. So we'll start things off with the thing most people forget he has on him when they fight him, which is his left arm. Before the eclipse, Guts' left arm was a regular human arm made of flesh, bone, muscle, and blood. But after he lost it to Borkov, he got a metallic upgrade that increased his war potential 1,000-fold. That's because Guts can take out a small unit of soldiers with just his left arm, given that it's got both a repeater crossbow and a friggin' cannon installed in it. Let's talk about the repeater crossbow first because it's one weapon that doesn't get enough respect. It's just what its name makes it sound like, a crossbow that bypasses the long reload time and allows its user to fire off rounds repeatedly. While that might not seem like a huge deal to you, it makes the difference between life or death on the battlefield because historically, crossbows were tricky weapons to work with. They packed a lot of power, ensuring one-shot kills, and they're more accurate than bows thanks to the stability they provide. But reloading a crossbow is a tedious task that requires special equipment and a lot of strength. If you guys have seen Game of Thrones, you might remember there was a scene where Joffrey Baratheon was showing off his latest crossbow. On a character level, it was meant to display just how braggadocious and obsessed with killing Joffrey was, but on a mechanical level, his pride made a lot of sense. Joff's new crossbow came with a reload mechanism that put the reload time at well under a minute, which is a massive improvement considering how taut crossbow strings need to be. Now, imagine a crossbow that doesn't have to be pulled back all the time just to make it work. That's what makes Guts' repeater crossbow so special. Its inventor, Rickert, figured out a way to connect both the reload and launching mechanism to a lever that Guts can rotate to rapidly fire several rounds of crossbow bolts. It has a storage mechanism where multiple bolts can be lined up for use, kind of like a gun's magazine, and while the bolts might not be very useful against apostles, tear through humans with scary efficiency. Watch some gameplay footage of Berserk, the Millennium Falcon chapter on the PS2 if you're not convinced. You'll understand the true value of such a fast, long-ranged weapon when you see Guts clearing out entire areas with just the repeater crossbow, and that's just the first of its two main functions. The second is the arm cannon that's hidden behind the palm, and this thing packs a punch powerful enough to blow apostles in half. In fact, when he first used it, Guts nearly dislocated his shoulder because it used up too much gunpowder, increasing its impact on both him and his enemy. Guts needs to pull a small string to drop his wrist and unsheath the arm cannon, but at point-blank range, it's been shown to be able to hurt a God Hand member as well, as evidenced by Guts' battle with Slan and Kliphoff. The arm cannon has saved Guts' life on multiple occasions when he's gone up against enemies that simply outclass him on a physical level, like the Snake Baron or Rosine, who could break the sound barrier when flying. But all of that becomes sort of secondary when you realize that the metal arm's main purpose is to allow Guts to swing a sword again, which it does through magnetism. Rickert magnetized the palm of this arm to allow Guts to grip swords without the fear of dropping them, and when he's fighting enemies that are way too weak, Guts simply uses the arm itself to break their faces into so many pieces. The metal of the crossbow arm cannon is dense enough to change the trajectory of incoming blades, and yet light enough to not be a hindrance to Guts' movement. It's a true marvel in and of itself, and one of the best technological innovations in all of Berserk, beyond a doubt. From the perspective of ingenuity, Guts' left arm would be at the top of our list, but we're ranking things based on how iconic they are, and sadly, there are two weapons that outrank this tank of a hand. But before we move on to those, we just have to give props to the arm cannon's creator once more, because Rickert might just be the most important inventor in the Berserk-verse. He not only figured out how to automate crossbows and compress cannons, he also created a device that technically shouldn't even exist, and that is special mention, Rickert's rocket launcher. This thing shouldn't exist in Berserk. Rocket launchers are an extremely modern invention which were created after centuries of humans experimenting with cannons and trying to make them smaller and more efficient. That's how guns came into existence, and yet Berserk exists in a pre-gun world. There aren't even rifles here, which means that its technology is comparatively primitive. So, the fact that Rickert figured out how to build a rocket launcher, even if it is single-use, makes him one of the most intelligent people in the history of Berserk. As great as Guts' left arm is, this invention is more fascinating because it's built with a rather simple yet effective mechanism. Rickert's rocket launcher, as we mentioned, is single-use. It's created with this empty log that has a trigger and a hammer. It can carry only one charge of explosives, but at point-blank range, that doesn't matter. When Rickert pulls the trigger, the hammer collapses and shoots the rocket at the target he's locked onto with the scope. When he used it against Rakshas, Rickert entered a class of his own as one of the few humans to have killed an apostle. His creations have been killing apostles for over 2 years though, so maybe Rickert himself should be on the list. The kid doesn't really have Guts' bloodlust, but he sure can come up with insane delivery systems for it. That's why we just wanted to give this rocket launcher a little shout out, because when we saw it, we couldn't believe what we were witnessing. And honestly, in many ways, we still can't believe that little Ricky had that thing on him. Berserker Armor. At number 2 on our list is the Berserker Armor, and this might confuse some people. I mean, the series is called Berserk. Surely the armor named after the series should be the most iconic thing about it. But the fact is that the Berserker armor was introduced over 200 chapters into the story, and Kentaro Miura admitted in interviews that he didn't intentionally name it after the series' title. Having said that, we'd be fools not to put this weapon this high up on our list, because while it is an armor set, make no mistake, its offense is much more impressive than its defense. The Berserker armor was created to amplify a human's fighting instinct on a physical, mental, and emotional level. It was made to draw out every ounce of energy from a human's body by blocking out their sense of pain and amping up their hatred, anger, and malice within their hearts. When a user fully syncs with the armor, they become a warrior akin to the Vikings of old. Their bodies can make leaps that human bodies simply shouldn't be able to make because it negates the very concept of pain. If the user has his bones broken, the armor fixes those bones by digging into them and putting them back in place. There's a massive debuff associated with using it, of course, because great reward only comes through taking great risks. Because the armor goes beyond what the human body should be capable of doing, it eats into the user's body as compensation for this enhanced strength and speed. But Guts has proven many times that high-risk, high-reward strategies work themselves out in the end. His use of the Berserker armor, while not perfect, was good enough to defeat the strongest apostle from the series and a literal deity in the sea god. He would never have won those fights without the Berserker armor's abilities, and he knows that, which is why he keeps on wearing it. Another trade-off for obtaining inhuman offensive ability is that the armor slowly steals the user's senses away from them. Their eyesight worsens, they stop tasting food, and they start losing control over their nervous system. This makes them reliant on the armor for self-defense, which is kind of like an addiction, but despite all that, no one can doubt the effectiveness of the Berserker armor or how iconic it is. When Nosferatu Zod looks at a weapon and seems to hesitate because of it, you know you've got something special on your hands. But speaking of Zod and weapons, it's time for the top entry on our list, and every struggler worth their salt has probably already guessed what it is. Dragon Slayer. It was too big to be called a sword. Too big, too thick, too heavy, and too rough. It was more like a large hunk of iron, and it was called Dragon Slayer because it was made as commission. A long time ago, King put out the call for a sword that was powerful enough to kill dragons, but Berserk was firmly in its realism era at that point. The blacksmith, who truly understood the assignment, aka our man Godot, knew that nothing a human could wield would be able to kill a dragon. So he created this 6-foot-tall monstrosity, not knowing that the man he was sheltering while he trained in the mountains would prove him wrong one day. It's true that wielding Dragon Slayer is impossible, more than that, impractical, and yet that's why it's the most iconic weapon in Berserk history. It's been with us as long as Guts has, thanks to the Black Swordsman arc, and when we were reading through the Golden Age, we had to admit that we kept asking ourselves when Dragon Slayer was going to show up. In a world filled with fearful mortals, Guts wields this demon killer like some god out of myth, and he's killed so many dead spirits, possessed creatures, and apostles with Dragon Slayer that he's a celebrity among demons. Hell, big swords existed in anime and manga before Berserk, but this series made them a mainstay. That's how iconic it is. So yeah, of course, our top choice was always going to be Dragon Slayer. We'll give a shout out to Guts' old sword as well while we're at it, because that thing was insane as well. It allowed him to fight off 100 armored knights in a single night, and yes, those knights were wearing full armor, but Dragon Slayer would have made that job so much easier because it can cut through half a dozen armored men with a single swing, and that's when Guts is having a bad day. There's simply no weapon as recognizable as Dragon Slayer in the entire realm of sword and sorcery fiction, and that's why it's at the number 1 spot. Marvelous Verdict. We hope you didn't mind the long road we took you down, but don't worry about Ari Yappin anymore because that's all we have for you guys in this one. Let us know which weapon from Berserk is your favorite down in the comments. Who knows, maybe we'll make a video out of it. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content in the future. We'll see you guys again real soon, so until then, stay safe and remember, keep on struggling, strugglers.